Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first ever Industry Musings, what is, I hope, a recurring feature as a part of my Patreon. Hi there, everybody. I am Jason Bulmahn. I'm a game designer. You may know me from such games as Pathfinder. But these days, I also run my own business. I run Minotaur Games, and I also run a Patreon where folks can hear and learn about my thoughts and ideas and get sneak peeks at my upcoming side projects and get a look at all the things that I do. Today, we're going to be doing the first Industry Musings. This is a series designed to explore and look at topics that are germane and important to the game industry at large right now. And there is no bigger topic out there anywhere than the topic of tariffs. Everyone in the game industry is talking about it. Today, I thought I would sit down and tell you about what the tariffs are all about, how it impacts us, and how it is a danger to the game industry as a whole. Now, before we get going, a couple things. First of all, these ideas are obviously mine. These thoughts are mine. These aren't representative of the ideas or thoughts of any company out there. And I do want to stress, especially when it comes to this topic in particular, that I am not a lawyer and I'm not a tariff attorney. So take all of this with a grain of salt. These are my thoughts and ideas. They shouldn't be construed as legal advice. All right, so tariffs. Everybody's talking about them. They've been a big subject of discussion in the game industry and in the broader economy as a whole, because as of late, the U.S. has added tariffs to a lot of goods and then paused them and then added them and then increased them and then decreased them and then gave exceptions. It's chaos. That's the biggest challenge I think facing the game industry right now, is just the unpredictability. We don't know how much the tariffs are. We don't know how much they're going to be next week. We don't know how much they're going to be a month from now. And when you work in a business where you make things that take months to create and then months to manufacture and then they're shipping and all that sorts of things, tariffs that are shifting and changing constantly create a big challenge. It makes things very unpredictable. It makes planning and business a big challenge. Now, what's a tariff? A tariff at its heart is a tax. It is a tax that is levied on goods shipped into a country, paid by the company receiving the goods. It doesn't get charged to the people overseas. I don't care who says it. That's not how it works. Even if there was a way to charge it to the person on the other end, they would just raise their price to you. And in essence, it's the same thing. So it doesn't work that way. It is a tax collected at the port, and it is a tax collected from the company that is importing the good through that port. So that's what it is at its heart. Now, before we kind of dive into how tariffs are impacting the game industry, it's perhaps best if we start by looking at kind of how games are made. So I've got a couple graphics here, a couple slides I'm going to run through, and we're going to look at how games are made. So here's how it starts. First of all, here we have a map of the world. There are companies everywhere, there are manufacturers everywhere, and all over the place there are people making games, people making products, but in this case we're going to be talking about games in particular. And let's just say that you were a company up here in the Pacific Northwest and you make games. Now, there's an important distinction here that's worth talking about just briefly, and that is that most game companies are not manufacturers. They are publishers. And the difference here is that a manufacturer actually makes the physical product. A publisher, generally speaking, creates the thing, but then someone else actually makes it. So most game companies are, in fact, publishers, not manufacturers. And that's going to be a very important distinction, because when a game starts, it starts off as a great little idea, as a concept and thought, and it is a thing that you spend months, if not years, refining, developing, and creating. This process involves initializing what the idea is, what the game is. It involves ordering manuscripts. It oftentimes involves freelancers, where you hire freelance artists and freelance writers to create various aspects of it. We do this all the time in my day job. I do it myself as part of Minotaur Games, where I hire freelancers to do editing, I hire freelancers to do art, and I myself do a lot of the writing. So at the end of the day, you incur all of these costs. And these are initial costs. And I want to stress that I'm not including the costs of like people's salary who work for the company. That's taken into account a little differently. But these initial costs do factor into a product's overall price. So if you spend a lot on art, if you spend a lot on edit, these are fixed one-time costs, but they do factor into how a game is totally costed. So you spend all this time working on it, you edit it, you lay it out, you play test it, you do all that stuff, and eventually you hit a point where you're ready to ship it to the printer. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this back on, and let's see. Here we are. We're back to here, and here you got your manufacturer or your publisher, and they have created a game, and the next step is to ship it to a manufacturer. Now, in this case, I'm selecting China. And I do want to stress that although China is by far one of the largest manufacturers in the world, especially when it comes to role-playing and card games and board games, there are other manufacturers as well. And we'll kind of come back around to that later. But China by far has the kind of largest base of manufacturers for card and board games. And what happens is the game files go to them. They create proof samples. They maybe ship those back to the publisher for checking. But by and large, they're the ones who actually physically print and make the game. They're the ones who then package it up, put it on boats, and that takes us to our next step, shipping it back. So the games then get put on boats, and those boats leave port, and they arrive in this case, the United States, where they then go from wherever that port is back to the publisher or one of their designated warehouses. I want to stress that throughout this, I'm not going to be talking about freight and shipping and all those sorts of costs. Those are an important calculation, but it's a bit in the reeds for what we're trying to do. Most of the time, and I do want to say most of the time, shipping is an added cost, usually paid for by the publisher and kind of sunk into all their background costs of doing business. There was a point in time a few years back where there was huge problems in the ports, and all of a sudden shipping containers increased by an order of magnitude in terms of price. That really screwed up everything. But for this, we're just going to focus on this kind of initial process here. Publisher makes game, ships it to manufacturer ships it back, ships the finished game back, and those go to the publisher's warehouse. Now from there, surprise, surprise, the publisher ships it out to game stores, and those are going to be all over the place. It's usually a little bit more complicated than that, and we will talk about this a bit too, in that generally speaking, the publisher actually ships to distribution. And distribution is kind of a middleman who sits between the publishers and the game stores. And its job is to efficiently distribute games and kind of serve as a point of contact and point of reference for all those game stores. That way, the publisher doesn't have to do that themselves. But in this case, to keep it simple, the publisher ships their game to distribution ships it out to game stores. And it's not just game stores in the US, it's game stores all around the world and distributors all around the world, right? So that's kind of the beginning to the end. At this point in time, it's not really the end of the product. It gets bought by a customer, they go play it, they love it, they tell their friends about it. But as far as money changing hands, that's the end of the line. It gets to a game store, somebody buys it, and that's it. So, pretty simple. I mean, not. It is a large, complicated process that takes many months to complete. There's the entire period of time where you're doing design. There's the entire period of time where it's, in the manufacturer's hands and they're making it. They're going through proof copies and they're setting up their final print run, and then they print it, they box it, they palletize it, They put it on a boat. The boat goes overseas. The pallets get unloaded, or the shipping containers, if there's enough of it. And those then get trucked to there. This entire process can take, the minimum amount of time, generally speaking, is almost a year. But in truth, many games actually start their life cycle 1.5, 2 years, 3 years before they make it to the retail shelf. Now that delay is important because it does really speak to the challenges that we're all facing. Because the tariffs have been changing wildly, at least here, as of this recording in mid to late April. The tariffs, for a while, they were changing every other day. They've stabilized for a little bit right now, but there's no guarantee that they'll stay that way. So now that you see how the game is made, roughly, in terms of its steps, I think it's time for us to talk about the costs. So let's do this in reverse. And I'm picking a generic number here just because it makes the math simple. So let's say a game has a manufacturer's suggested retail price, MSRP, of $100. That means at the game store, you go to buy it, it costs $100. That's an expensive game. It's probably a big board game or a set of books or something, right? But let's just say, sake of the argument, it's $100. Now, obviously, it didn't take $100 to make because it goes through all of those steps. And each step along that process, everybody makes money, right? Because otherwise, why would they do it? They're only going to do it if they make money. So let's walk backwards from that MSRP all the way back to how much it costs to make. So first, you've got your MSRP, it's $100. That's how much the game store costs. Now, of everyone in this process, the game store is perhaps the most vulnerable. They only have their limited audience. They're in a much smaller pool. They have to buy games in advance to put them on their store shelf. And as a result, they make a good chunk of the money. A lot of it. In fact, they make about 50%. So if a game costs about $100, it's going to cost that retailer about $50 for them to buy. Now, an important thing to think about here is retailers only have X amount of capital, right? They're not, don't get me wrong. Some of them are rich and just have a game store for fun. But by and large, most of them are businessmen and businesswomen, business people. And they are in this to make money, but they have to choose very wisely where they invest that money. They can buy inexpensive things. They won't return as much of a profit, but maybe they'll turn faster. Maybe they'll sell them faster. Think of it this way. Every game store is going to sell chips and sodas and stuff if they have game space, because they're going to turn that stuff very quickly and they're going to make their money back and get the profit back. It's a real problem when they buy something that's really expensive that then doesn't move, because their capital is now locked. They're not making money from it, and that's a real problem. So as a result, retail tends to get a pretty big margin because they are taking kind of the biggest risk. If their stuff doesn't move, they go out of business very fast. But that's their cut. Now, it's not always 50%. I do want to stress here, I'm generalizing some numbers. There's a lot of variance in here. They might have gotten it for a discount. They might have paid more for it based on a deal, or they may order so much through distribution that they get better prices. I'm not really talking about any of that. We're just going to keep it simple. They pay about 50%. Now, next stage is distribution. Remember, there's a middleman between the retailers and the game companies that helps get the product out there. Now, they also have to buy the product. They buy it from the publisher, but they are taking a little less risk because they have all these game stores they can sell it to. They can put things on discount. They've got a lot more capital to play with. They're a lot bigger players. Some of these companies are huge, spanning multiple states or even entire countries or even multiple countries. So they, however, don't get as much, but they also move all of the products. So they get somewhere between 5 and 10%. It depends on the distributor. It depends on deals. It depends on all sorts of stuff. For sake of the argument, we're going to call it $5, which means for every $100 game that gets bought, distribution makes $5. Now, they may sell a ton of those, and the moment they leave the door, they're done. That's it. They don't generally take returns, especially not in the hobby games industry. There's different industries where returns are more common. That's a different sort of thing. So let's say distribution pays $45. Now, who did they pay $45 for the game for? Well, that's where the game company comes in. So the game company got $45 for it. Now, let's talk about what the game company did. Now, the game company didn't make $45. They had to pay to make the game. They also had to pay those art costs, those editorial costs, and things like that. So let's say that their cost of goods is $20. Now, that's a term you're going to hear thrown around a lot in the game industry because cost of goods is basically your manufacturing costs plus your static costs. Things like art and, freelance writing and things like that. Again, this doesn't cover people's salary and health insurance and building costs and computer costs and stuff like that. All of those things come out of the money that the company makes between the cost of goods and that distribution cost. Now, it's also important to note that a lot of game companies will sell direct as well. That means instead of $25, they'll make $80. Now, to make ends meet, a lot of companies will budget between those two because what you're selling to distro is not going to be as much profit, but you use that to benchmark the final price. And this gets into the key formula that a lot of companies work with. They will have different formulas. Other companies will go with different percentages, but the basic rule is 5 times your cost of goods is the MSRP. Why? Because that gives enough space in there for the game company to make money. Because if they don't make money, they go out of business, then you don't get any more games. So, that's where we're at. So, how does that cost of goods break down? Well, let's take a look at that. So, most of the time, you get to amortize the cost of the art and the editorial and all that sort of stuff across the entire print run. So a bigger print run makes that cost smaller and smaller. The upside is the bigger the print run, the smaller the manufacturing price per unit, right? So if I order a game, and let's say I order a book from a publisher or from a printer, the manufacturer, and I order 1,000 of them. That book might cost me $20. But if I order 5,000 of them, the book might only cost me $15. And if I order 10,000, the book might only cost me $10. They give you price breaks based on more that you print. Why? Because in general, most of their time is actually spent in setting up the print process. Running the printer and the raw materials is a smaller component of that. So the longer they can just make the machine run to make the thing, the less it costs per unit. They still make their money out of it. But to keep things simple here, we're just going to assume a flat fee and work from there. It doesn't really matter how much you save on this. It still comes back to game companies will generally charge 5 or more times the cost of goods. Some do 8, some do 10, some do higher than that. Now, that's why when you go to like a big box store, you will see games that are very inexpensive despite having a lot of components in them. This is because they're taking advantage of economies of scale. They're printing so many that their cost of goods drops, and that means they can lower their MSRP and still make a good profit. Because again, just like the game store, game companies and distribution and retailers all have to look at how much of their money they're investing in a game and how much they're going to get back out of it. Because none of them have infinite money to play with, right? So if your game company has $100,000 to spend on making a game, it has to have that money come back in a multiplied amount to pay for staff, to pay for buildings, to pay for insurance, to pay for all the sorts of things that a company needs to pay for. And at the end of that, also to have some profit left over for the people who own the company. So I think you probably are starting to get a sense as to where this is going. So let's take it one step further and start talking about tariffs. So let's talk about, and I'm going to use the big example right now, and not everything is tariffed at this rate. I do want to say that a lot of people talk about tariffs kind of in a simplistic manner. Tariffs are actually really complicated. There are, harmonized tariff schedules, codes, I forget the exact acronym, but basically everything that gets made gets put under one tariff code or another. And even in this hyperbolic times where everyone's talking about tariffs in the hundreds and hundreds of percents, it's usually not uniform across all products and goods, right? That's why you will see exceptions carved out for electronics or the car industry because they have big lobbyists. And, you will see other things that just get tariffed into oblivion. So for the point of this example, I'm going to talk about what the tariff number is being floated around right now for the games industry. And this doesn't apply to everything, but we'll work with it from here. Because even if the number is smaller, the effect is still the same. So let's say you've got a game that's being charged 150% tariff. And I want to stress that is a ridiculously high tariff. Tariffs are usually 5, 10% or something like that. And it's meant to be a way to encourage companies to make things in their own country. And I want to come back to that, but we're not ready to talk about that just yet. So at 150%, that's applied to the manufacturing cost, not to the art and edit kind of flat costs. So we get to take those out, but 150% of, say, $15 is $22.50. That changes the cost of goods from $20 to $42.50. Now, if you look at what I've highlighted here, that means that if the game company doesn't change its prices, it makes $2.50 of profit instead of 25. Because again, the tariff is charged to the game publisher, not the manufacturer. So the end result is the game company basically makes no money on this. Now, there's a lot of different ways you can go from here. But I want to stress and remind you that game companies, just like everybody else in this chain, have to look at how much money they have, how they invest it, and how much money they're going to get back for their investment, because that's all the money they have to invest in new things, because they have bills to pay. So if you're saying, I'm going to invest $42.50 on a game, and I want to be clear, that's an outrageous cost of goods for a game. That's very high. And only get $2.50 back. That's not going to work. It's not going to work. You're going to see game companies go out of business if they try and keep that. Now, obviously, the answer is, well, they don't do that. They just take the $22.50 and add it on to the next stage of the process to keep the $25. Now, this is kind of unrealistic. Why? Because the game company, again, has to invest this money in a product and they're expecting a certain amount of return. And this is not the right amount of return, right? So for $42, they should be making more than $25. But for the sake of the argument, let's just look at what adding $25 profit in there does. That means the distro cost is going to be $67. Now, distro isn't going to care about what tariffs we pay, and neither is the game store. They just look at how much it costs to bring the game into their store. So they're going to do what they're going to do, which is they're going to charge, an extra percentage on top of that, so the distro company can still make money. They'll make, between what they sell for retail and what they sell, what they buy from distro. If they're paying $67, they'll probably charge retail somewhere around $75. That means retail, because again, they have to play these games too. They have to make enough profit off of the money that they invest. The MSRP has already jumped $50, and that's with the game company taking a bath. Now, I know what you've been waiting for. So let's look at the worst case scenario, which is the game company just assumes the tariff is a cost of goods. So the game company would need to make $53. Remember, off a $20 cost of goods, they made $25 in profit. If you take that same percentage and say the game now costs $42.50, the distro cost has to be about $95 so that the game company can make $53 off of its $42 investment. Then distro's going to raise that and charge retail about $105, $106, $107, $108, somewhere in there. Which means the MSRP for this game just jumped to $212. Now, you might sit back and say, well, isn't everyone involved in this just making more money? No, because now, instead of buying, 10 copies of a rule book that they have to pay $10 each for, The retail store is going to buy one copy of a board game. Remember, they don't have infinite money. They can't stock their shelves with as many things as they want. They only have X amount of money to spend every month to bring new things into their store. So the end result is the game company orders less. So this thing feeds back. You end up with a feedback loop where the game company has to raise its prices, distro has to raise their costs, the game store has to raise their costs. They only have X amount of money to invest, so they buy fewer copies. They buy fewer copies of this. They buy fewer copies of everything because the prices are going to go up across the board. So as these tariffs hit more and more parts of the industry, you're going to see more and more companies have to raise their prices, because I do want you to step one step further back here. Because these tariffs aren't just hitting games, they're hitting everything that comes in overseas, and last time I checked, that's a lot of stuff. So as the prices for everything starts going up, all these companies are going to start looking at more ways to make more money, and the only tool they have is by raising prices. If the prices everything is going up, you join in, because that's the only way you keep pace, because your costs go up. Your employees need to be paid more. Everything you buy costs more. And there's a term for this. It's called inflation. So tariffs like this often historically have been tied to horrific ramps of inflation, high costing problems, and challenges for every industry that has had to suffer under them. Excuse me. So, let's talk about a couple of the edge cases and things that are going on here that a lot of folks are talking about, a lot of folks are thinking about. I'm going to go ahead and drop these out for now. So a lot of people have said, hey, well, why don't you just print in the United States? Or why don't you print in somewhere other than China? And to tell the truth, there are options for some things to be printed in other places. There is manufacturing in other parts of the world. But it depends on what you're making. You can get cards printed in the United States relatively easily. It's a little hard. It's a little expensive, but there are card printers in the U.S. There are book printers in the U.S. They don't have necessarily the same quality. Maybe they don't have the same kind of paper. Maybe they don't that. But they are also more expensive. Now, the tariffs are going to make those more attractive. Problem is, it's going to make it more attractive for everyone, which means those companies are going to get slammed. And what happens when a company gets slammed and doesn't have time in their production schedule? They raise prices. That's supply and demand 101. The demand has gone up. The supply has not gone up, which means the price goes up. So that is an option, and it's an option a lot of folks are exploring. I know I have certainly started exploring them for some of the projects that I'm working on, like Hellfinder. I've started looking at what it would take to print that here in the United States. I had originally gotten some contacts from some folks in China about possibly doing some of the printing for it. And frankly, as of recently, I told them, yeah, until this situation resolves, I don't see a route forward. The printing options I have in the United States are going to be less expensive. Still more expensive than printing in China before the tariffs. Now, there's another problem as well, in that some things just can't be made here. We don't have the industrial base for them. Now, that's a little hard to imagine. But I want you to think, plastic injection molding machines aren't something that just grow on trees. If you don't have them, they're incredibly expensive. They take a lot of technical expertise to make. And to top it off, you also have higher labor costs, because the U.S. Has higher labor costs. This manufacturing base doesn't exist. And you can't just snap your fingers and have it appear overnight. Now, if that seems a little hard and nebulous to grasp, let me give you something a little bit more straightforward that has also been heavily impacted by tariffs. Coffee. There's very little coffee grown in the U.S. The U.S. doesn't have the right climate for coffee, except for Hawaii, and Hawaii is not very big. So where does most of our coffee come from? It comes from South America, it comes from Africa, it comes from Asia, because that's where the climate is right to grow coffee. So putting a tariff on coffee, well, I mean, there's no way to be like, well, I'm going to grow coffee in America. No, you're not. That's not possible. I remember seeing the price of vanilla was going to skyrocket because most of the world's vanilla is grown in Madagascar. These things happen in specific places. Now, in the case of manufacturing like this, obviously, America has done manufacturing, does do manufacturing, but only of specific things. Other things got outsourced, moved to other places, or just organically grew in those places. That's where the manufacturing was. So it's a complicated problem. It's not something you solve with easy, 10-second slogan solutions. Every company, especially in the games industry, is looking at these codes, looking at the tariffs associated with them, and trying to figure out, how do we continue to stay in business? How do we continue to pay all of our people, to make sure everybody has a good living wage? And how do we make sure that all the way down the line, from game companies to, from publishers to manufacturers to distribution to game stores to gamers, how does everybody feel good about this process? I don't think anybody in this industry is like, yes, finally, a chance to charge $200 for a $100 game. That's just not how any of us think. Most of us are just here for the passion of the games. This industry has always had a razor-thin margin. It's always been tough to earn a long-term living in this. Game companies come and go all the time. And tariffs like this that add uncertainty to the process have only exacerbated the issue, right? I mean, especially when you consider, remember, we all work on really long timelines. There have already been reports of companies who have games sitting in China. They've been manufactured, but they can't ship them. Because if they ship them, when they arrive in port, that's when the tariff is due. Now, some folks got lucky. They had things on the water. You generally get a grace period if the tariff changes while your thing's in shipping. But that's running out for everybody, right? So, you're getting to the point now where everybody has to go, okay, how do we print this? Where do we print this? How do we get this in? What do we change the price to? It's tough. There aren't any easy solutions here. Anybody who's trying to offer up an easy solution to this hasn't really dug too deeply into it. And that said, it is also more complicated than it appears, right? There are some things that are not as highly tariffed as people think. There are certain classifications of books that are not as highly tariffed. Whether or not games books fit into those is an open question, and that's the question that a lot of people are figuring out. Now, as this drags on, you're going to see game companies go out of business. I think there's already been one or two high-profile notions or mentions of that. I'm not going to mention them here, but I think there are some folks who have already looked at this and said, we can't make this work. And, I think that is only going to continue the longer this goes on. I think you're going to see game companies move and delay things. They're going to shift things around. Everybody is looking for ways to just try and make it through this. Now, the easiest way for all of us to make it through it would be for the tariffs to go away. But that's not really something in any of our control. So that's the current pickle we're all in, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, my first ever industry musing. For those of you on my Patreon watching this live, please stick around. We are going to be doing a Q&A following up the credits here in just a moment, so stick around for that. I'll happily answer your questions. But for those of you watching this later on YouTube, I want to thank you all for watching. Hopefully, when this airs, everything will be different on YouTube, but that won't be for about a month from now, so we'll see how it goes. So that's all I have here tonight, everybody. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting my Patreon. You know who you are. And we will see you next time.